remain muted to minimize background noise. And if you want to be recognized outside of regular order, you can identify that with the chat and email, or you can just unmute your mic and tell me. We'll begin the hearing in just a moment when they tell me they are ready to begin the live stream. And hello to all of our wonderful witnesses who've joined us. This is going to be a really important hearing for America.
Okay. Once you gavel in,
Good morning. Thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. Thanks to all of the members participating. We're in the middle of votes, so there's going to be a little bit back and forth in classic congressional style. And I'm very happy to be here with the wonderful ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Nancy Mace. In 1943, in West Virginia versus Barnett, the Supreme Court struck down compulsory flag salutes as a violation of the First Amendment, stating, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it's that no official, no matter how high or petty, shall prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of politics, religion, nationalism, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Then in 1969, in a case called Tinker versus Des Moines School District, which struck down Mary Beth Tinker's suspension from middle school for refusing to remove her black armband in protest of the Vietnam War, the court affirmed that neither teachers nor students shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. In 1982, most relevant to our hearing today, in Board of Education versus PICO, the Supreme Court rejected the effort by a town school board in New York State to strip objectionable books from public school libraries. The members had gone to a conference promoting censorship of offensive and vulgar books and came back with a target hit list, the kind of hit list which is now familiar to us, including Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, Best Short Stories of Negro Writers, edited by Langston Hughes, Go Ask Alice by an anonymous author, Black Boy by Richard Wright. And after widely brandishing a compilation of the most prurient and lurid and profane passages, the board actually overrode its own censorship committee, which had recommended purging only 2 books from the schools, and went ahead and censored 9 of them. When the case made it to the Supreme Court, the majority sided with the students, who were claiming that the removal of books from the school library affected a form of political and ideological thought control totally antithetical to the First Amendment of the Constitution. Justice Brennan, who had been nominated to the court by Republican President Eisenhower, announced the judgment of the court and delivered an opinion that was joined by Justice John Paul Stevens, who had been nominated by President Ford, Justice Harry Blackmun, who had been nominated to the court by President Nixon, and Justice Thurgood Marshall, who had been nominated to the court by President Johnson. So this was a decision dominated by Supreme Court justices who had been nominated to the court by GOP presidents, which is something that we need to think about, because I hope, Ms. Mace, that everything we talk about today will transcend the traditional party lines. In Board of Education versus PICO, Justice Brennan found that the Constitution protects not just the right to speak and to write, but the right to receive information and ideas. The First Amendment plays the central role in affording the public access to discussion, debate, and the dissemination of information and ideas. Freedom of inquiry, the court ruled, extends to school libraries, and the selective removal of books from school libraries because someone considers the content offensive directly and sharply implicates students' free speech and thought. In school libraries, the regime of voluntary inquiry holds sway. The answer to books whose content or viewpoint you oppose or even deplore, check out this powerful logic, is to not read them or to write a negative review or even, shades of Voltaire here, to write your own book in answer. The First Amendment, I used to tell my constitutional law students, is like Abraham Lincoln's golden apple of liberty. It's like an apple, and everybody just wants to take one bite out of it. Somebody hates left-wing speech, and somebody hates right-wing speech and wants to censor it, and somebody hates hate speech about gay people, and someone wants to censor speech about the love lives of gay people, and someone wants to censor Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn because it uses the N-word, and someone else wants to censor Ibram Kendi's anti-racist baby because they think it means that babies can be racists. Everybody wants to take just 1 or 2 bites out of the apple. But if we allow all those bites, there's no apple left. The freedom of speech disappears. The way to save the apple for all of us is to learn to tolerate the speech you abhor as well as the speech you agree with. It's not always easy, but this is incumbent upon people living in a free democratic society. If we cancel or censor everything that people find offensive, nothing will be left. Everybody is offended by something, and that's why other people's level of offense cannot be the metric for defining whether your rights or my rights are vaporized. There's a famous story about Lenny Bruce, the somewhat risque comedian from the middle of the last century, and someone said his show should be shut down because it offended him. And Lenny Bruce said from the stage, "My parents came to America in order to be offensive and not to be thrown in jail for it." Now, during National Library Week, a time to celebrate intellectual curiosity, scholarship, freedom of inquiry, and free expression, basic intellectual freedoms are under attack again. In 2021, the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom recorded the highest numbers of censorious challenges to library books in its 20 years of tracking this data. 729 efforts to censor nearly 1,600 books. And in Texas, just one of these attempts to censor books, implemented by a state legislator, has initiated the systematic review of at least 850 books in every school district in the state. There are over 1,000 school districts and 8,000 public schools in the Lone Star State. This challenge will require tens of thousands of teachers, librarians, and administrators to spend hundreds of thousands of hours reviewing the books to implement a regime of censorship at a time when school resources are already stretched thin and states across the country are facing teacher and staff shortages. The vast majority of books being targeted are not mandatory or part of the curriculum. They are books of choice. Students can pull them off the shelves if they want to and check them out, or they can ignore them entirely. What books are being targeted? Well, some old favorite targets are back, like Catcher in the Rye, Native Son, Huckleberry Finn. I would also, there are also a bunch of these books I brought here. Seahorse. We're going to hear today from the great Ruby Bridges, whose book Ruby Bridges Goes to School has been the target of censorship moves. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which is who is a Nobel Prize-winning author. A kid's book about racism has been targeted for censorship. A book called Hair Love. The infamous anti-racist baby book. Little Legends, Exceptional Men in Black History. And finally, Little Dreamers, Visionary Women Around the World. So these are some of the most common books that are being targeted right now. Obviously, it's a legitimate subject for parents, teachers, principals, and school boards to discuss which books are the best and most age-appropriate curricular choices for different age groups and grades. This is what educators do, and the best ones include families, parents, and experts in the decision-making process all across the country. But that normal curricular and library selection process is completely different from whipping people up into a moral panic over the use of this or that word or passage in a book and then demanding its removal from a school library. Fashions and censorship change. For a great deal of our history, books were censored because they were considered indecent or politically subversive. For example, of the slavery system, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was seized, censored, and burned in many southern states as propaganda. Many books are being targeted for censorship these days simply because they address racism or white supremacy as historical or sociological realities, or address human sexuality or LGBTQ issues because the protagonist or author is gay or a person of color or for some other allegedly objectionable reason. Finally, I'm not quite sure where this is, if you can give me this. I wrote a book which was censored called We the Students, I'm sorry, forgive me, I correct myself. It has not been censored yet, but it's being targeted for removal from the schools in Texas. We the Students was amazingly sponsored by the Supreme Court's own historical society. It analyzes the constitutional freedoms of young people in public schools. It looks at a whole bunch of cases that affect kids in public schools, like censorship of newspapers in your books and locker searches and drug testing. And I am certain now that it must be the first book ever sponsored by the Supreme Court's own historical society, which is now being targeted for censorship. I only wish that the aspiring censors would read my discussion of Board of Education versus PICO at page 59 in my book before they censor it, because it tells them everything they need to know about how it is illegitimate to strip books from school libraries because somebody disagrees with it. Okay, so the books on the poster boards have all been targeted for censorship or actually banned from schools. This Is Your Time by Ruby Bridges, a remarkable figure in the American Civil Rights Movement, who we have the honor of hearing from today, has been challenged and targeted for censorship. Why? Simply because it said that a book describing the story of how a little girl who was one of the first to integrate public schools in her native Louisiana in the midst of a racist backlash may make white children feel uncomfortable. And this, I think, radically understates the powers of empathy, compassion, and solidarity that all children, or most children, have and are capable of developing. It also suggests that the actual lived experiences of people should be suppressed if learning of their experiences would make other people uncomfortable, a far-fetched, unworkable, and unjust principle that cuts against the fundamental American idea of free expression. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Mace for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should have brought my book in the company of men and women at the Citadel this morning.
I brag about your book all the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to highlight the importance of freedom of speech in our country, as well as the important work to ensure that K-12 curriculums in public schools serve our students well. The First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees the right of freedom of speech to all Americans, and the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. The government may only set reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions in very limited circumstances. The government cannot and should not police the speech of its citizens, even when that speech is disagreeable or repugnant. When they say it aloud, sometimes we want to know what they have to say. We don't punish thought criminals in this country unless, of course, you're maybe a main character in Orwell's 1984. Freedom of speech isn't just a legal mandate enshrined in our Constitution, it's an essential element to democracy. This fundamental freedom ensures all views across the spectrum are debated within the marketplace of ideas, and public institutions of higher education are bound to abide by the First Amendment's prohibition on restrictions on freedom of speech, yet often in this country we see attacks on that very freedom. Public universities and colleges frequently run afoul of the First Amendment freedom by enforcing broad or overly broad speech codes, or by chilling speech across college campuses, using biased response teams to investigate thought criminals. There have also been disturbing campaigns on these campuses to expel students, fire faculty, or disinvite speakers who hold views that are considered to go against the progressive consensus or groupthink. These universities and colleges are unlawfully stifling speech to coddle young adults at a time when in their educational careers where they should be exposed to a variety of ideas and perspectives. While progressive activists shut down speech on college campuses, they're trying to hyper-expose young children who are still learning to read, write, add, and subtract. And I can personally remember a story when my kids were in elementary school, and I was driving them home, picked them up from the carpool line in school that day, and they had a government lesson on government democracy versus socialism versus communism, and I asked them, which one's best? And they said socialism. So I pulled over on the closest exit off the interstate and had a conversation about the differences, and then they walked out of that conversation. She says, no, Mommy, democracy is the best form of government for the United States of America. In an effort to indoctrinate our young students, progressives are burdening curricula with divisive and radical ideologies such as race essentialism, racial scapegoating, and content of a sexual nature that's not appropriate, oftentimes for very young children. All children should be taught the academic skills they need to succeed, along with the history of our country, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We must also teach our children about the problematic chapters in our history And we must also teach them about the heroes who lead us and have led us to a more perfect union. In fact, one of those heroes today is joining our hearing today, Ruby Bridges, who you mentioned earlier, a civil rights icon and author who made history as a 6-year-old girl, courageously braving a hostile crowd to integrate an all-white elementary school in Louisiana. And in my home state of South Carolina, we have so many of those heroic stories that should be taught in our schools, from Harriet Tubman, who rescued 750 slaves in one night in Beaufort County, South Carolina, to Joseph P. Rainey, who was the first African-American to represent in the U.S. House of Representatives, who represented, by the way, South Carolina's 1st congressional district, the seat that I sit in today. Public schools should exercise discretion with parental input and oversight to decide what is included in their curricula and what books to include in their libraries, especially for young elementary school students. But no child attending our public schools should be subject to government indoctrination or exposed to radical ideologies while they're still building the foundations of their education. Instead, we ought to be teaching critical thinking skills so college-age students can discern, argue, and act on those values when faced with open and frank academic discourse. And of course, our high school students, even if they aren't going to college, should be prepared to enter the workforce when they graduate. I thank all the witnesses for appearing today and looking forward to a robust discussion on the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and how we can work together to preserve that freedom for every single American. Thank you, Chairman Raskin, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Mace, for a very thoughtful opening statement. Before I introduce our witnesses and swear them in, I just want to state that PEN America just released a report this morning finding that from July 1st of last year to March 31st of this year, there were 1,586 book bans that were implemented across 86 school districts in 26 different states. 41% of the banned titles had protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color, 22% directly address race and racism, and 33% explicitly address LGBTQ issues. So though that's not a majority, that's a lot of where the action is. And of course, there are the traditional targets that we know of, like Catcher in the Rye and Huckleberry Finn and George Orwell's 1984, and so on. Now, I want to introduce our first panel of witnesses, who are all high school students and will be testifying, but not answering questions. First, we have Shreya Mehta, who is a student from Richland, Washington. Good morning. Then we're going to hear from Olivia Patuk, who is a student from York County, Pennsylvania. Finally, we'll hear from Christina Ellis, who's also a student from York County, PA. The witnesses will be unmuted so we can swear them in. Please stand and raise your right hands if you can do that. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have all answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. And with that, Ms. Mehta, you are now recognized for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Shreya Mehta. I'm a senior this year at Hanford High School, a public school in Eastern Washington State. I want to start off by thanking the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to testify today. It's an honor to be representing the students in our country, both as an organizer and as a book lover.
It'll help us if you can just speak. Can you just speak directly into the camera and the microphone as close as you can? Just because you're fading out a little bit.
Okay. Okay. So my district has had fewer outward book challenges, but the internal damages the culture of censorship of BIPOC and LGBTQ+ voices and stories has caused is immense. I believe that the rampant censorship is affecting even more districts than we think and supporting the bullying of marginalized students around the country. The rise in book bans in my district has created a lot of fear, so that entire classes centering diverse perspectives and plenty of new books that have been proposed have been stopped in their tracks for no other reason than fear of retaliation. I've spoken personally with educators who have been coerced into putting away books with LGBTQ+ or racial equity content. Marginalized students have unfortunately become collateral damage in this current moral panic. Just a week ago, I went to a school board meeting where a man spoke out against homosexual teachings and a woman spoke out against gender equality books. And these are some of the same adults who scream for bans, but also misgender students and call them things and threats which is why I believe this censorship is in large part tied to a lot of bullying happening. And oftentimes thinly veiled racist, sexist, or homophobic political statements that impede a student's right to intellectual freedom and to embrace their individual identities. I think students have their right to check out age-appropriate material from their libraries, whether or not it contains material that's divisive. Because the fact of the matter is that students are facing divisive topics in their everyday life, and they need to know that they're not alone in their struggle. And I keep on asking myself, how many decades will it take before we can raise a generation of LGBTQ+ students in particular who aren't institutionally guided and systemically educated to be as invisible and ashamed of themselves as possible?
Ms. Mehta, forgive me. I hate to interrupt you. Ms. Mason, I just have to go vote. We're going to freeze your clock right there at the halfway point. We'll be back as quickly as we can. We're going to drive over there, and then you can come finish it, and then we'll go to our next witness. Thanks, everybody, for hanging tough.